Om Sadashivasamarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Good. Be seated, please. Shura. Okay. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanao Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvisha vahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Right. Welcome to all of you, and welcome also to our many students watching online. Today is actually Gita Jayanti, and I explained it before in our meditation session. If we're going to celebrate Gita Jayanti, what should we do? And I'll be a little sarcastic. Should we put the Bhagavad Gita on the altar and do arati, offer flowers, all of this stuff? Bhagavad Gita is not really meant for that kind of worship. It's meant to study. The most traditional way to celebrate Gita Jayanti is to recite the whole 18 chapters. It takes about 2.5 hours. And it's wonderful to do, but the idea is you should recite it knowing the meaning, not just to recite Sanskrit syllables. So instead of reciting all the Bhagavad Gita, the second best way to celebrate Gita Jayanti is to study. And that's what we'll be doing today in our celebration of Gita Jayanti. We are in chapter 14, Guna Traya, the 3 gunas, and we'll begin with some recitation, beginning with verse 5. And as always, as I'm chanting, read the meaning and then repeat after me. Sattva rajas tamayati, sattvam rajas tamayati, guna prakriti sambhavaha, guna prakriti sambhavaha, nibaddhanti mahabaho, nibaddhanti mahabaho. Dehe dehinam avyayam, dehe dehinam avyayam, tatra sattvam nirmalatvat, tatra sattvam nirmalatvat, prakashakamanāmayam, prakashakamanāmayam. Sukha sangena badnati, sukha sangena badnati, jnana sangena chanagha, jnana sangena chanagha, rajo ragatmakam vidhi, rajo ragatmakam Trishna Sangha Samudbhavam, Trishna Sangha Samudbhavam, Nibadhnati Tannibadhnati Kaunteya, Tannibadhnati Kaunteya, Karma Sangena Dehinam, Karma Sangena Dehinam, Tamastvajnanajam vidhi, tamastvajnanajam vidhi, mohanam sarvadehinam, mohanam sarvadehinam, pramadalasya nidrabhyas, pramadalasya nidrabhyas, Tannibadhnati Bharata, Tannibadhnati Bharata, Sattvam Sukhe Sanjayati, Sattvam Sukhe Sanjayati, Rajah Karmani Bharata, Rajah Karmani Bharata, Jnanam Avrityatu Tamaha, Jnanam Avrityatu Tamaha, Pramade Sanjayatyuta, Pramade Sanjayat, Rajasthamascha Rajasthamascha Sattvam Bhavati Bharata, Sattvam Bhavati Bharata, Rajasattvam Tamaschaiva, Rajasattvam Tamaschaiva, Tamasattvam Rajasthatha, Tamasattvam Rajasthatha. Very good. Let's return to verse 5, which we saw in our last class, which introduced the main topic of this chapter, the three gunas. Now, I want to remind you, the word gunas here are used in two very different senses. The most common use of the word guna is to refer to quality. So we have three qualities. Sattva guna, the quality of goodness, of pureness, purity, saintliness. Rajas, the quality of passion and desire and activity. And tamas, the quality of darkness and ignorance and lethargy. They're often, in fact, most often used. The words, the three gunas, are most often used in the sense of quality. But as I mentioned in our last class, here they're used in a different sense also. And a different sense is in a more fundamental sense. In a prior chapter, we studied Prakriti, nature, that from which the entire universe evolved. Well, that Prakriti is called Trigunatmaka. It consists of three gunas. Prakriti, nature, consists of three gunas, which means nature consists of three gunas. So then, in this sense, they're understood as not three qualities, but three fundamental constituents of nature. We can't call them elements because we also have 5 elements. The gunas are actually more fundamental than the elements. A more fundamental constituent even than elements, just like in Western science. We have over 100 elements, but there are more fundamental constituents, in particular, matter and energy. So from the Western standpoint, we look at nature through the lens of matter and energy. From this ancient standpoint, we look at the universe from this threefold nature. The three constituents, sattva guna being a constituent of nature, rajoguna, a constituent of nature, tamas, the third constituent of nature. To give you an idea, a more concrete idea, what do we mean by constituent of nature? Tamas is the constituent out of which material elements come, like your body. Your body is the result of tamas as a constituent of nature. So not tamas as a quality. We're not saying your body has a quality of tamas, but rather your body and anything physical comes from tamas as a constituent. Also, your body has prana, life force, and the ability to move. These would be traced to the constituent of rajas. So the presence of tamas gives you physical reality. The presence of rajas gives you life force and the ability to move. And the presence of sattva give rise to all your mental faculties and your sense organs. So this gives you a little bit more concrete idea of how we understand the three gunas, not only as qualities, but also as these three constituents. And that's what we discussed in our prior class. Going forward, one more thing. In the last class, we saw this in third line, nibadnanti. These three gunas bind you. And that's a reference not to the three gunas in terms of quality, but the three gunas in terms of material constituents. So the three gunas, from this standpoint, represent the physical world. And you are bound to the physical world. By rebirth, you take birth in this physical world and you become subject to suffering. So that's the idea of being bound here, and that theme is going to continue in the next three verses. And the very next verse, he's going to say that you are bound by sattva. Now, that sounds really confusing if you look at sattva from the standpoint of a quality, because sattva guna is the best for the mind. But here, remember, our context is not gunas as qualities. Our context is gunas as constituents of nature. So sattva then is part of the physical, I won't say physical, part of the cosmos. And you are bound in the sense that you're born into that cosmos and therefore subject to suffering. For this reason, we'll see this teaching later, that Atma, your true self, is beyond the three gunas. Triguna atita, beyond the three gunas, and we'll discuss that later. So now understand, when we say that you are bound by the gunas, it means you're bound to life, you're bound to the world. Let's continue then with verse 6. Tatra sattvam nirmalatvat, tatra sattvam nirmalatvat, prakasha kamanamayam, prakasha kamanamayam, sukha sangena badhnati, sukha sangena badhnati, jnana sangena chanagha, jnana sangena chanaga, cha Anagha. Anagha, Sri Krishna addresses Arjuna as the sinless one. O Arjuna, back up at the top, tatra, with regard to the three gunas, sattvam is sattva guna, and here's sattva as a constituent of nature, not as a quality. Sattva is prakashakam, shining, and anamayam, free from affliction. Why? Nirmalatvat, because of its innate purity. The way to understand this is, we said that your mind and intellect are the products of sattva guna as a constituent. So your mind is, in fact, your mind is sometimes called sattva. You've heard the term sattva shuddhi. If you've ever heard that Sanskrit expression, shuddhi, purity, purity of sattva, here in that expression, sattva means your mind. Don't be tricked by that expression. Sattva shuddhi means purity of mind. And your mind is inherently pure because it is sattva guna pradhana. It is a manifestation of sattva guna, but our mental activities are not necessarily sattvika. Your mind is inherently sattvic, but inside this mind, the contents are not necessarily sattvic. Lots of rajas, lots of tamas, that's natural for your mind to be full of those contents. But here's the way to understand the mind. When your mind is perfectly quiet, like in deep meditation or in deep sleep, When your mind is perfectly quiet, what remains is pure sattva guna. And again, sattva as a constituent. So this is how to understand sattva guna as a constituent. The manifestation of that sattva guna is your mind when it's perfectly silent. And definitely your mind when it's perfectly quiet is prakashakam. It's shining with consciousness. It reflects consciousness. It is anamayam. It is unafflicted. Nirmalatvat, because your mind is free from the impurities of rajas and tamas when your mind is perfectly silent in deep sleep or meditation. But then here comes the problem. And as I said, here sattva is referred to not as a quality. As a quality of mind, sattva is desirable, extremely desirable. But sattva as a constituent is still worldliness. So the sattva as a constituent binds us to the world. And specifically, Sri Krishna says here, it badnati, it binds one. How? In two ways. Sukha sangena, by attachment to sukha, happiness. And here, this is a major problem. You want your mind to be happy 100% of the time. Correct? Would you be okay if your mind is not happy 99? If your mind is happy 99% of the time, and right now is the 1% when your mind is not happy, and I ask you, are you okay? Are you comfortable with that? No. I want my mind to be happy 100% of the time. Is that reasonable? Isn't that interesting? We all feel that we want to be happy 100% of the time, and yet we readily admit it's unreasonable. We want an unreasonable condition. There's something wrong, which is why we're following Sri Krishna's teaching to address some of our wrong thinking. It's unreasonable, but this is attachment. We want it. I want my mind to be pleased, to be happy 100% of the time, and that's a problem. Because, as we saw in the meditation session, when sadness is present in the mind, when happiness is present, it's okay. When sadness is present, it's not okay. Well, wait a minute. Happiness is natural. Sadness is natural. How can you say one is okay and the other isn't? That is your conclusion. You have wrongly concluded that you are not okay in the presence of sadness. And it truly is a wrong conclusion because, as you've already understood through these teachings of Vedanta, the sadness of your mind doesn't affect your true nature at all. Your true nature as consciousness is utterly unaffected by the sadness in your mind, but you don't recognize that truth. Therefore, when sadness is present in your mind, you want it to go away. You want your mind to be, I'm going to give you something very subtle now. Watch this. You want your mind to be different than what it is. Wanting anything to be different from what it is the definition of discontentment. Reality is what it is, right? Suppose I want the weather to be different from what it is. How silly, right? Immature, the weather is what it is. If I want the weather to be different, my failure to accept the reality of what is, my desire for it to be different than it actually is, that desire makes me discontent, makes me suffer. If that's true about the weather, Isn't it also true about your mind? When you want your mind to be different from what it is, it's like wanting the weather to be different. The weather is natural, your mind is equally natural. I'm not saying to ignore psychological problems. That's a different issue. If something's broken, fix it. That's just common sense, and that's not what we're talking about right now. Just talking about normal happiness and sadness are equally natural, but when you are attached to happiness, what he says in the third line, that attachment makes you suffer. Jnana sangena cha, and you're attached to knowledge. Here, knowledge is the means by which you gain happiness. Knowledge doesn't mean just intellectual knowledge, but it represents all of your skill to manipulate the world around you to get what you want and avoid what you don't want. The word knowledge represents all of that. So think of it as skill, the skill of living. And what is the skill of living? As I just suggested, the skill of living is to manipulate the world around you to get what you want and to avoid what you don't want. Problem with that should be obvious, right? Suppose I don't want rain. Can I manipulate the world to get rid of the rain? Suppose manipulating the world around me includes the people in my life. Manipulating the people in your life for your own sake. To manipulate the people in your life to get what you want and to avoid what you don't want. My God, what kind of attitude towards life is that? But it's common. You know that. So this is the problem of the constituent of sattva guna manifest in your mind when you are attached to happiness and when you are attached to this knowledge in the sense of the skill of manipulating the world around you. That attachment makes you suffer. In fact, not only makes you suffer, when you suffer, have you noticed? When you suffer, you have a way of making those around you suffer also, right? That happens naturally. So not only does this problem of attachment, it not only makes you suffer, but it definitely rubs off, so to speak, on those around you. So this is the problem of attachment born of sattva guna. Next verse is rajas. Rajo ragatmakam vidhi, rajo ragatmakam vidhi, trishna sanga samudbhavam, trishna sanga samudbhavam, tannibadhnati kaunteya, tannibadhnati kaunteya, karma sangena dehinam, karma sangena dehitam. Kaunteya, O son of Kunti, Arjuna. Shri Krishna addresses him. Back up at the top. Rajas, by the word rajas, when it's followed by a soft consonant, becomes rajo. The word is rajas independently, but when you combine it, like rajas plus guna becomes rajo guna. These are simple Sanskrit rules. That rajas, vidhi, O Arjuna, you should understand that rajas is ragatmakam. It consists of raga. Raga can mean passion, raga can mean desire, raga can mean that kind of intensity. I want it, I want to get it, I want to run away from it. Raga and dvesha, we've discussed in so many classes. Raga, the inner compulsion to run after what you want, and dvesha, the compulsion to run away from what you don't want. Notice that raga then gives, raga and dvesha, they give rise to action. That's really the point here. We say that here rajas as a constituent element. Remember, we're not talking about qualities right now. We're talking about constituent elements. As a constituent element, Rajas, I shouldn't call it element, that's confusing. As a constituent of nature, Rajas is responsible for motion, for activity, for life. And here Sri Krishna makes it very clear. He says that that Rajas is Trishna, Sangha, or Asanga, either way, Samudbhavam. It arises from Trishna, desire, and Asanga, attachment. Arises from desire and attachment, or simply it arises from Raga, Dvesha. Here's the point. Raga and Dvesha lead to action. That's the connection between Rajas as a constituent and desire. Desire, both positive and negative, raga and dvesha, desire to get, desire to avoid, these desires lead to action. In the complete absence of desire, there's no action. So desire leads to action, and action is the presence of Rajas as a constituent of nature. Kaunteya, O Arjuna, tat nibadnati. That guna called Rajas also binds you to the world. Rajas being one of the constituents of the world, you are bound to it. How? Karma sangena dehinam. So, Tannibadnati, that Rajas binds whom? Dehinam, the embodied person, and binds how? Karma sangena, through attachment to action. Not too hard to understand. So when you feel raga and dvesha, the compulsion to chase after what you want, the compulsion to run away from what you don't want, means you're highly committed to running, one way or the other. Suppose you're prevented from running. You won't be what do they say? You won't be a happy camper. How's that typical American expression? You'll be very unhappy. You want the freedom to chase after what you want. You want the freedom to run away from what you don't want. And if you don't have that capacity to run one way or the other, you won't be happy. You want that capacity to act. That's karma sangha. When you have the capacity to act, you're okay. When you are deprived of the capacity to act, you suffer. In psychology, they talk a lot about we need to feel in control of our lives. And if we don't feel in control of our lives, we're subject to emotional difficulties. So that idea of feeling that sense of control over your life here is called karma sangha, attachment to action, and it's a source of suffering. Because you're in control of your life partially, right? Only partially. Are you in control of whether or not you develop some form of cancer? You're in control of your diet and lifestyle, but are you in control of every cell in your body, which might start to mutate when the DNA gets mixed up? That cell can mutate and start becoming cancerous. We have no control at that level whatsoever. So here's the idea. We do need to be, relatively speaking, in control of our lives. That's healthy. But if you think you can be completely in control of your life, that's karma sangha. And it leads to suffering. Then comes tamas. Tamas tvajnanajam vidhi, tamas tvajnanajam vidhi, mohanam sarvadehinam, mohanam sarvadehinam. Yes. Pramadalasya nidrabhis, pramadalasya nidrabhis, tannibadnati bharata, tannibadnati bharata. Bharata, oh Arjuna, anyone who's descended from King Bharata is Bharata. Back up at the top. Tamas tu. You have to break that word tu out from the middle. Tu, but tamas, Arjuna, vidhi. You should understand that tamas is ajnanajam, born of ignorance, which is mohanam, which deludes sarva dehinam. It is deluding for all beings. Ignorance causes confusion. Ignorance, more than that, ignorance causes suffering. And this is a fundamental teaching of Advaita Vedanta. Let's be very sure that you understand properly. Ignorance is indeed the root cause of all suffering. Why? If you knew your true nature to be divine, if you knew your true nature to be utterly unaffected by any problem around you in the world, any problem of your body, any problem of your mind, if you knew your true nature as such, what would make you suffer? If your perspective was, I am Satchidananda Atma, full, complete, vast, limitless, unborn, uncreated, unchanging, and utterly untouched by suffering. My gosh, when you have that perspective, you are, so to speak, immune to suffering. That is the result, that immunity to suffering is the result of the discovery of your true nature, that so-called inner divinity, which, as we've talked about before, is an already existent truth, right? It's not that you become divine, it's that your true nature has always been divine, but that inner divinity goes unrecognized. Why unrecognized? Covered by the so-called veil of ignorance. Due to ignorance, you fail to recognize your own divine nature, and as a result, you suffer. This is the important teaching of Vedanta, that ignorance is the root cause of all suffering. Please note, other traditions, biblical traditions, will say the root cause of all suffering is evil. That's absolutely not what's taught here. The root cause of all suffering is ignorance. And that ignorance, mohanam, it afflicts, it's an affliction, sarva dehinam, for every embodied being, every embodied person. That ignorance is an affliction, and in the last line, tat nibadnati, that tamas, in the form of ignorance, it nibadnati, it binds you to a life of suffering. How? Pramada, this is the most obvious one. Pramada is making a mistake, error. Pramada is error. To think that this is me is pramada. To think that the sadness in my mind deprives me of contentment and peace is an error. Pramada. For all the reasons we discussed in our meditation session before. Your consciousness is utterly unaffected by that sadness. Your inner divinity, if we want to use that expression, utterly unaffected by the sadness in your mind. If you think that the sadness in your mind affects you, you've made a mistake. That is an error. That is pramada. And of course, it leads to suffering. So not only does error make you suffer, but also nidra, sleep. In a sense of We can be very metaphoric, or we can take it literally. Sorry to be a little silly, falling asleep in class, which happens sometimes, that would lead to the persistence of ignorance. And we will take it in a more metaphoric sense, and that is, how about, here's a nice metaphor, sleeping your way through life. Have you heard that expression? Sleeping your way. It means you go through the motions. You get up in the morning and you're groggy and you drink some tea and you take a shower and you go to work and you do all this. And it's just like so mechanical, so thoughtless. Sleeping your way through life. So that nidra in that metaphoric sense also. And, I missed one. Alasya, laziness. That's pretty obvious. So this tamas as a constituent of nature can lead to laziness of one's character. So that now laziness is guna as a quality. Here we're referring to both tamas as a constituent of nature and tamas as a quality. So that alasya, laziness, is definitely associated with tamas as a quality. And laziness means you don't accomplish anything in life. So now you're suffering in a twofold way. You're suffering because you haven't discovered your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. And secondly, you're suffering because you're too lazy to get off the chair and do something about the problems in your life. So you have this twofold suffering, a kind of a worldly suffering and a spiritual suffering. All of this is due to tamas. Next verse summarizes this topic. Sattvam sukhe sanjayati, sattvam sukhe sanjayati, rajah karmani bharata, rajah karmani bharata, jnanam avritya tu tamaha, jnanam avritya tu tamaha, pramade sanjayatyuta, pramade sanjayatyuta. Sanjayati, for our Sanskrit students, the prefix sam often means well, but it doesn't mean that here at all. Sam in a sense of samyoga, together. So samjayati, it literally born together, brings together. So sattvam brings together in a sense of binds. That's our topic, right? But nabadnati, he's been using the verb, so now he's using a different verb. He says, sattvam sanjayati causes bondage, sukhe, to sukha. This is just summarizing the last three verses. We said before, you want to be happy 100% of the time. That's an unreasonable expectation. Your unreasonable expectation will definitely make you suffer. So in this way, sattvam sukhe sanjayati, sattva guna, the quality, the constituent because of which your mind and intellect exists, it causes bondage to this unreasonable expectation that I should be happy all the time. And Bharata, O Arjuna, Rajas binds you karmani, to action. I need, actually many people have the problem, maybe even I have the problem, I can't just sit. And to me, and for me though, it's a very pragmatic thing. Sitting is boring, except when I'm meditating. I can meditate nicely, but if you just want me to sit and do nothing, I'll get up. So that's normal, but that which is normal can become a need. someone who needs to be active all the time. You need to be chasing after what you want. You need to be running away from what you don't want, constantly engaged in this worldly pursuit. We call that the treadmill. All of the mice running on the treadmill. So this is being bound to karma, is being on that treadmill, always seeking. A life of perpetual seeking. Why perpetual? When you're seeking happiness, do you ever completely, you get little bits of happiness. Do you get it completely? Do you ever get the one thing, having gained which you are happy and content for the rest of your life? Is there such a thing? There's no such thing. Not only that, but you're also busy. You're busy not only running after what you want, and you're busy running away from what you don't want, but sometimes you can't avoid what you don't want. Cancer, as an example. So this attachment to karma, the false conclusion that I can control my life in such a way that I can be free from suffering. Wow. That's bondage to karma. If you believe you can control your life, by the way, as a young man, I remember feeling this quite strongly. I used to, when I was in my 20s, I'm laughing at myself because in my 20s, I thought I knew it all, and I was the biggest idiot. You can imagine, I was so arrogant and stupid, literally, because I believed that if I worked hard enough and smart enough, I could create the best possible life just by working hard enough and smart enough. The arrogance of a young man, of a stupid young man. So this is the problem. If there's any idea that you can control the world around you in such a way that you can ensure your happiness, this is the bondage to karma, which will absolutely make you suffer. And finally, jnanamavrityatu tamaha. And tamas, actually you have to connect it to the last line. Tamas, samjayati uta, breaking the words apart. Uta, and tamas samjayati causes bondage, pramade, to error. In fact, we just talked about an error, thinking that you can control the world. But here the error is referring to what my guru called self-non-recognition. Failure to recognize your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, failure to recognize that inner divinity, that is due to ignorance. He says, jnanam avritya, your knowledge being avritya, covered by ignorance. When your true nature, avritya, that's the right word, when your true nature is covered by ignorance, you then fail to recognize that inner divinity, and as a result of that particular ignorance comes raga and dvesha, that compulsion to get what you want and a compulsion to run away from what you don't want. That is the opening salvo, as they say, for a life of suffering. The initial problem that causes a life of suffering is that ignorance. Okay, now next topic is so we're done with this. Next topic is a very, very important one, because now we're kind of back to discussing sattva, rajas, and tamas more as qualities. So far, we're discussing them more as constituents of nature. Now we're shifting to a more psychological level. So far, it's been a more existential level. What is stuff made of? Now we're talking about it from a more psychological level. And this is a very important, not just in spiritual life, but in life in general. And let's see the verse, and then we'll have an important discussion based on this. Rajas tamas chabi bhuya, rajas tamas chabi bhuya, sattvam bhavati bharata, sattvam bhavati bharata, rajas sattvam tamas chaiva, rajas sattvam tamas chaiva, tamas sattvam rajas tata, rajas tata. Good. Start in the second line. Bharata, again, O Arjuna, sattvam bhavati. And here we're talking now the quality of sattva. Sattva bhavati, it exists, and let's say it expands. Yeah, when you see the end of the first line, abhibhuya, when sattva overcomes or overpowers rajas and tamas. When the qualities of rajas and tamas in your mind are overpowered, notice we're back to qualities. When the qualities of rajas, that desire, that chasing after what you want and running away from what you don't want, that's rajas, and tamas, ignorance, lethargy, when those undesirable qualities are abhibhuya, are overcome, then what? Sattvam bhavati. Sattva becomes predominant in your mind. And let's make this very clear. Every human being has a mind which is predominantly sattvika, sattva-guna, but tainted with various degrees of rajas and tamas. And the problem comes when these other factors of rajas and tamas, when they grow, we have problems. In fact, that's exactly what Sri Krishna says. Let me just take you through the rest of the verse. So when rajas, first line, when rajas and tamas are, I want to choose my words carefully here. And somebody said reduced, and I think that's quite a good word. Overpowered, though, is kind of the sense here, because how to reduce rajas and tamas? This is pure psychology. It's interesting. There's a lot of psychology in the Bhagavad Gita. So rajas and tamas, how do we do? So if I sit here on my high throne, so to speak, and I command you, I'm making fun of some teachers who are like this, and I sit on my throne and I command you, you must reduce, you must root out the rajas and tamas from your minds. I command you, you must root out the rajas and tamas from your minds. Some teachers are like that. You see the problem? How? So it's easy to tell you what to do and wag your finger at someone, but that's not teaching. Teaching is to empower the student to reduce the rajas and tamas. And Sri Krishna is very careful in the use of this word, abhibhuya. Actually, I should more formally say, whose words are these, really speaking? These are the words of Vyasa, based on a dialogue that took place on the battlefield. So it's not like Sri Krishna and Arjuna were speaking Sanskrit verses on the battlefield. We've discussed this before. So the word abhibhuya literally means to overcome. When rajas and tamas are overcome by what? by sattvam. And there's the key. How to get rid or how to reduce rajas and rajas and tamas. And the answer, of course, is by cultivating sattva. That's the key. How to, just a little 2 minutes of psychology. How to overcome a bad habit. By replacing it with a good habit. Right? If you just try to stop a bad habit, that's not a very realistic approach. If it's a deeply embedded habit, it's not something you can just one day choose to stop. By the way, that applies to people with drinking problems and drug problems. And allow me to be a little bit of an aside here. Someone who has a problem with drinking or drugs has an illness. Many people falsely think it's a character problem. You know, what's wrong with them? Why are they doing all that? They're ill. It's an illness. Addiction is an illness. It's not a character defect. And that illness can be treated. But the treatment means professional treatment. And there's varieties of treatment modalities, but addiction, like drugs or alcohol, is not a character defect. It is an illness that needs to be treated. But that's a very extreme case. I'm just talking now about an ordinary problem, an ordinary habit. You have a bad habit, you want to break that ordinary bad habit. To just stop is an unreasonable and basically it's not effective to just stop. So how to break that bad habit? By replacing it with a good habit. They say, for example, somebody who has a habit of smoking cigarettes, every time they want a cigarette, they should chew on a carrot. How's that? So chewing on a carrot is very healthy. So you replace an unhealthy and undesirable habit, you replace it with a good one. Chew on a carrot. Good. 20 times a day, chew on that, whatever it takes, just chew on that carrot. This gives you the idea. But this is a principle of psychology. In fact, this is the psychology attributed to the famous psychologist B.F. Skinner, the founder of this behavioral science, who, this is maybe 50 years ago, more than that, 70 years ago by now. And he taught that you change by changing your behavior. You overcome undesirable behaviors by cultivating healthy behaviors. And that, by the way, is perhaps Sri Krishna here anticipating B.F. Skinner by several millennia? Honestly, this is the underlying principle of behavioral psychology, which is a 20th century phenomenon. So anyway, some brilliant psychology we can find in the Bhagavad Gita. So Sri Krishna says you have to overcome rajas and tamas. How? By cultivating sattva. How do you cultivate sattva? By changing your behavior. How to change your behavior? Just reflect on the things you do in life. What activities are you engaged in that make you happier, healthier, stronger? Those are the activities that are sattvika. And activities that take you the other direction should be avoided. In fact, that's the rest of the verse. Let's see that before I forget. So in the second half of the verse, Sri Krishna warns you that rajas, you have to connect it to the top part. He says, rajas becomes dominant when sattva and tamas are overpowered. You have to put all of that in here. It's like shorthand. So the first half of the verse says, rajas and tamas get overpowered by sattva. Third line says, sattva guna and tamas get overpowered by Rajas. You can think of the workaholic maybe as a stereotypical example of Rajas being dominant, someone who works 18 hours a day. How about our famous friend, Elon Musk? I think he says he works, 16, 18 hours a day. He says so. Anyway, so Rajas is predominant. So Rajas can overwhelm and overpower Sattva and Tamas. That's a warning from Sri Krishna. And finally, Tamas can overpower Sattva and Rajas, Tata, in the same way. Tamas can overpower Sattva and Rajas. What is the message of this verse? Anything, and it's about your lifestyle. The basic principle here is by cultivating Sattva Guna, the quality of Sattva Guna in your mind, you will not only be happier and healthier in your day-to-day life, but your mind will also be a better instrument for understanding these teachings and gaining enlightenment. So there's a tremendous value in cultivating sattva. How to cultivate, there's a threefold strategy here. Anything in your life that is tamasic should be addressed. And I have to tell you, the most obvious problem that afflicts maybe half of our population, the most obvious problem is not getting enough rest, honestly. Because when you don't get enough rest, how do you feel all day long? Right? You're tired. And you're tired because you're not getting enough sleep. Many doctors have said that our country suffers from an epidemic of sleep deprivation. I'm not making this up. They say our country suffers from they call it an epidemic of sleep deprivation. And an epidemic has consequences. Just like the COVID pandemic we're just going through has terrible consequences. 1 million people died in this country due to COVID. So in the same way, the epidemic of sleep deprivation also has consequences. What is the consequence of sleep deprivation? You'd be surprised. Go look it up on the internet. You'd be surprised at the number of problems that are associated with sleep deprivation you wouldn't even think about. For example, you wouldn't think about it, but there's a strong connection between obesity and sleep deprivation. That doesn't sound intuitive, but it's been studied and measured and proven. So if sleep deprivation can cause something as severe and harmful as obesity, think about the many other ways that it can really mess with your life, ruin your life. And I'm being a little emphatic here because I had this problem. I'll just be very, very frank with you. During our 3-year course in Vedanta and Sanskrit with Pujya Swamiji, this was such a precious time for me. I wanted to make the best of it. And our schedule was already busy because we had many hours of classes each day. We also had many hours of work. As students, we were building the ashram during our 3-year course. So it was a very demanding environment. And on top of that, so hours in a class, hours of work, and I wanted for myself hours for study and meditation. So if you have 3 activities filling your day and there aren't enough hours in a day, what to do? Well, I thought you just cut down on the sleep. So I cut it down from 7 to 6. I cut it from 6 to 5. I cut it from 5 to, I think I got down to about 4.5. And then I started getting sick a lot. And I'll tell you, one thing very strange. I started to cry for no reason. This is illness. An illness called sleep deprivation. It affects us badly. It affects us physically. It affects us emotionally. So I'm being very forceful in this statement because it's a serious problem and it afflicts too many people. This is tamas. Not getting enough sleep is the primary cause for a life dominated by tamas. Get enough sleep, please. Then, rajas. What activities are in your life that contribute to rajas? So kids, youth have a problem of these video games. Okay, and I have a feeling few of you, if any, are playing these video games. But if there's any activity in your life that resembles it, some forms of entertainment, some kinds of movies and stuff are like that. So if a movie or any kind of entertainment has that kind of unnecessary stimulation, then think twice about it. We are all consumers of media. Like we consume food, we consume media. Are you careful about what you eat? I bet you are. At least somewhat careful about what goes in here. We should be equally careful about the media we consume through our eyes and ears. It's a good metaphor. Just like you're cautious about the foods you consume, we can be cautious about the forms of media you consume. Because as the food affects you physically, the media you consume will affect you emotionally. So, how to cultivate sattva? So far we're talking about reducing sources of tamas, reducing sources of rajas, and then if you're doing both of those, the last part is actually easy, to cultivate sattva guna. And I think what we're doing now is one of the most powerful ways of cultivating sattva guna, to spend time with Sri Krishna's teachings on the Bhagavad Gita. And especially today, as we said, we're celebrating Gita Jayanti. So what a wonderful way to celebrate Gita Jayanti, by immersing ourselves in these teachings. And in my opinion, there's nothing more powerful to lift you out of rajas and tamas and make that sattva absolutely dominant. This is number one. A close number two would be daily meditation. Yep. So if you don't currently have that practice, consider a practice of daily meditation. Very, very important. So in this way, you cultivate sattva guna, and that sattva guna will then overpower rajas and tamas. And as I said, you have a twofold benefit. It will make you happier and healthier in your day-to-day life. And secondly, it prepares your mind to be a better instrument for receiving these teachings and gaining enlightenment. Okay, that's a good place to conclude for today. A couple of quick announcements. This being Gita Jayanti, we just concluded publishing the 18th chapter of our Bhagavad Gita dramatic reenactment. The 18th chapter was published a few days ago. This morning, in celebration of Gita Jayanti, we published a version of all 18 chapters performed in English. Many people find that English very unique and very helpful, so that's just been published. A lot of people are watching it already, so if you're interested, have a look at that. The 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita performed and recited in English, that's available now. Tomorrow, Sunday, We have our Vedanta class at 11 o'clock, and it's another new chapter. These are very, very short chapters, so you can come tomorrow, and you'll be there for the beginning of the next chapter. And then immediately after class, we have satsang, and you're also welcome to come just for satsang at noon. I'll sit out here for a few minutes to greet you, and we'll conclude with our brief prayers at the altar. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspataha Nashrinvan Uttabasira Sadhanam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gurudhatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramhanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.